Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the issues that have already been covered by Andrew earlier and talk about our experience with looking at DCPs across a region. A bit of an introduction to how we came about this project that we're going to talk about. It's probably one of the top priorities for councils in our region in Western Sydney. We've talked a lot about development approvals happening in our region, about our growth. We've got an extra 1 million people coming in approximately 9 years, so our growth rates are pretty high at the moment. Because it was one of the most important issues, we found every meeting, every forum, every get-together, every training session ended up getting hijacked on this issue. We're spending hours and hours talking about what our common challenges were, how we can address them, how we can work together, how we can learn from each other. And a suggestion was made that instead of losing all of our meeting time to talking about this issue, we set up a separate forum to specifically address this issue and look at what we can do to progress as a region forward. So that's what we did. We set up the Western Sydney Waste Planning Group, and this has been running for 2 years now. This brings together 14 councils from across Western Sydney, not just Wesrock members, but our neighbouring councils as well that also face similar challenges and have the same demographics and same growth aspects as councils that we work with on joint projects. This forum brought together not just the waste managers, but when we started out, we worked very hard to bring together the waste staff with planning staff from various councils, looking at other groups that existed, so Western Sydney planning groups, and bringing them to be involved in the discussions that we were having. But more importantly, it also brought together project-level staff and officers who are the ones doing a lot of the legwork on the ground, so that they had an opportunity to talk to other staff that were working in similar fields to themselves, to be able to talk, to be able to learn, and to be able to thrash out some of the issues between them where those challenges were common across the councils. And what it all boiled down to was DCPs, as we've heard a lot about today. So as the issues kept coming back to DCPs, we started doing a lot more discussion around what the particular issues were in our DCPs and why this was a regional problem. And it came up a number of times, the discussion about a regional DCP, so I'm not surprised that the issue was just brought up again earlier. But in discussion with our councils, it was determined that it wasn't possible to do a regional DCP. There were far too many other issues that couldn't be resolved to get consistency across the region, to have one planning document that you may have 9, 10, 11, 14 councils all adopt to be consistent. However, we recognise that there is a lot of work to be done to try and firm up consistency, because the planning planners, the planning lobby, are lobbying very, very hard with councils with the issues for DA turnaround times, and also reducing red tape and the pressure from state government to have more consistency. So we looked at what was the next best thing. What can we do with multiple councils to try and fight back and meet halfway? Interestingly, in the meantime, we've had a review of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, which has floated the ideas around having more consistent DCPs and options for either mandating or providing drop-down box menus for DCPs across New South Wales. So I expect that over the next few months we're going to see a lot more about this, and pressure to have model DCPs across multiple areas, and waste is not excluded from this. So what we did was we got a review of multiple DCPs to look at where the consistencies were, look at what makes up the similarities and differences between our councils, and where were we falling through the gaps. So we work with SquareLink, and Milan's going to talk more about the findings of that.
Thank you, everyone. I think SquareLink basically went through a review of all the councils within the Wesrock and Macrock areas to look at, as Amanda said, the similarities or the gaps within the current DCPs within those areas. But I think it's important to set the context about where the review was looking at in terms of trying to get some outcomes. And it's also good to understand the context about DCPs and actually how they work within local government. We basically all want to achieve really good waste management outcomes in terms of developments and how they're actually achieved on the ground, what they look like on a day-to-day basis. To achieve those good waste management outcomes, we also have to work within a planning framework. That planning framework has different legislations across the state, but it's those documents that we have to use to make sure that development achieves those good waste management outcomes on the ground. That planning legislation doesn't just consider waste management, it considers a myriad of other issues that need to be dealt with as part of the development process. There's open space requirements, driveway requirements, parking requirements, building height, floor space. There's lots of them. And in terms of a planner who has to assess these within a short period of time because of the development pressure or the political pressure to try and stimulate development on a quicker basis, waste management is just one of those many issues that need to be considered. In parallel to that, you've got a state government, especially in New South Wales now, that is trying to push development across the state, across the regions, and you've got local governments who are trying to compete with that growth. They're trying to capture the population growth and the economic growth as well. Every council in this room across the state will basically, if you look at their strategic plans, will look about growth, how to get growth in their areas. And you've also got a development industry, and it has been mentioned in a few of the presentations that the developers are looking at making money. That is true, but developers run a business. They will basically look at whether a development is feasible on a certain site or whether it's not feasible. And the more information that's provided to them up front to inform that decision will make the process for them a lot easier, and also for councils. So when you go through a state government who's looking for development, you've got councils who are looking for development within the area to grow the economy. Developers are looking at how do they actually get development to work on the ground. The first place they go, as Andrew said, is they'll look at the planning policies within council. They'll look at the DCP. They'll tick off all the requirements within their site to achieve that outcome, do their feasibility and work out whether they're actually going to do the development or not. So the DCPs actually provide a very important policies for councils to actually demonstrate what they want to achieve in terms of their waste management outcomes. So it's then looking at about what information the developers see when they actually start looking at these feasibilities. So we went through the DCPs with that mindset, knowing that there is growth demands, there is a development industry that is keen to develop, and they want to get outcomes on the ground. So we looked at a couple of key criteria that we looked at waste management. One of them is what information the DCPs had in it, and one of them is did they make reference to the Better Practice Guide. Some councils did, some referred directly to that and said you need to be consistent with that. Some councils pulled out sections or relevant sections from that and said you need to be consistent with these components, but some DCPs were silent on it or didn't refer to it. Standard collection vehicles. These are the vehicles that drive down the streets, drive on site, pick up the vehicle, the bins, take them away. A lot of the DCPs were silent on what the council requirements actually are for a waste collection bin or a truck on site. So it makes it very difficult for a developer or anyone looking at developing a site to understand what are the size of the trucks entering their site or leaving their site. This is an example from the hills, which is quite simple. It basically shows the different types of trucks. It talks about what lengths they are, their heights, their widths, their turning circles, their operating heights as well. It's quite clear the developer will understand what the requirements are for it. Curbside collection. This is what council's requirements are for how the bins are presented at the curbside for the trucks to collect. It's quite simple. You know how many bins you're going to have from a development. You know how you as a council or councillors want to present it at the street. A lot of the DCPs were silent on it. So the developers are guessing about how they actually collect the bins, how it will be actually collected, what are the restrictions that council will impose in terms of number, widths. We've got verges that do have street trees, wide driveways. What are the restrictions in terms of gaps between those bins? As I said, most of the DCPs were silent on that. On-site servicing requirements. This is when trucks are entering a site of multi-unit developments or residential flat buildings. The trucks are entering the site, collecting the bins and leaving. A lot of the DCPs are silent on how these trucks, in terms of sizing, how they actually are expected to go on site, what their height requirements are, what their turning movements are. And it makes it very difficult for developers to understand what impacts that has on the actual development itself. And if you don't do it early in the process, it's very hard to retrofit a lot of those on-site requirements after it's already been considered or the developers already drafted up their plans. So we've got another example here of the hills where it's quite simple. It's a paragraph, but it quite clearly states that there has to be clear. So they've already got a requirement in terms of the truck size, and now they're basically saying you've got to have clear manoeuvring on site in a forward direction on and off the site with no reversing, but if it is, it's very restricted. So it's quite clear in the DCP. The developer is aware of it. Indemnity agreements. This is basically you're having your trucks or a contractor's trucks entering private property to collect bins, move around. These are large trucks. Only 2 councils have indemnity agreements or requirements to enter into an indemnity agreement. Now, these are quite important documents. They basically acknowledge that council vehicles or contractors' vehicles will be entering a site, and there are restrictions in terms of how to enter the site. It doesn't necessarily have to be within DCP, but there must be it'd be good to have some sort of reference to it that it is important for councils to have it. And we've got a council here that has basically done, I think it's the Blue Mountains Council, which again is a quite clear statement that basically says if you have a truck entering your site, you need to enter into a deed of agreement. And there's a specific link within that paragraph to where within council you'll find that document. So that gives a clear picture to the developer of what is required. Bin allocations. Across the Wes Rock area and the Mac Rock areas, there's a variety of different types of bin sizes that are used by councils for their operational processes or their tendering process for collection. They range from 240, 360, 660s and 1,000 litre bins. Some of the councils basically say these are the requirements, but they don't specifically say what are the requirements within each of the councils for those bins and how they are treated for multi-unit developments. Single lot housing is quite simple. Most councils have a 3-bin system. Each dwelling gets a 3-bin system. It's quite simple. When you start entering into the multi-unit or residential type developments, the DCPs were very silent on terms of what is expected from those developments in terms of a developer providing the number of bins, the sizing of bin, how it's going to be collected on site. That flows on also to waste generation. The DCPs or information guidelines are lacking in terms of how waste generation figures are calculated, which then informs that process of identifying how many bins, bin sizes need to be provided within the sites. We've also got bulky waste storage areas. Unlike communal ones, the bulky ones, some councils will require them, some councils won't. There are different thresholds in terms of what councils are expecting these areas to be in terms of size and the size of development to require a bulky bin area. Again, these things take up a lot of space, and if it's not identified early in the planning process or the DCP, they tend to get missed, and it's very hard to retrofit these back into the development later. Communal waste storage areas, probably because townhouse development's been around for quite a while, these tended to be quite well included within the DCPs. They included things like amenity, visual impact, the design requirements, health and hygiene requirements. And Penrith City Council have a very clear illustration within their DCP that shows spatially on site where the communal areas would be, how the bins are then to be presented to the curb, and the size requirements of it. So it's quite simple, quite clear. This is what's required from council for the communal areas. We've put in waste chutes, and as Andrew said, some councils like waste chutes, some councils don't. The important thing is that the technology is changing all the time in terms of how waste is treated on site. Councils need to be mindful that DCPs aren't always the best place to put some requirements in. If you need flexibility in terms of how you want to deliver some of these waste management outcomes, there are other mechanisms of how to achieve those and not just having a DCP. Communication was probably one of the issues that we found needs to be addressed but needs to be considered by councils. Is the first port of call for developers or designers or architects who are looking at developing within local government areas. They'll go to a DCP, they'll go to the council webpage and they'll try and find the information. Some councils had the information, but when you go to search on their webpage, you can't find it. The information is actually not on there, accessible from the webpage. Some of the information was looking at waste management plans, so it was just basically looking at the construction and demolition requirements of the site, and it left it at that. It didn't really go into the servicing requirements, where some of them went more into the servicing but not the waste management side of it. So the key findings that we found from ours is there's probably two key areas that councils need to be aware of, and that is the planning policy side of it. Development control plans are a policy within council. There are other ways of providing that information, whether it's an information guide or whether it's design guidelines. The development control plan basically sits over that. They are very hard to change, so for councils looking at trying to incorporate flexibility or innovation within their waste management streams, development control plans tend to be quite a cumbersome thing to change over a period of time. Design guidelines give you a bit more flexibility in trying to change those quite quickly. The DCPs need to be consistent across the different areas. So it's waste, but it's also how they interact with the other ones. Landscape requirements, open space requirements, traffic, transport, all those things. They need to be consistent across it. There's no inconsistencies. The use of illustrations and diagrams are important because they're quite quick and simple, and they illustrate what council is trying to achieve up front. And also, councils also should consider the standard conditions of consent as well that link to their DCPs. It's very hard to have very simple standards conditions which basically say a developer needs to provide a landscape, a vegetation or a waste management plan. Later on in the process, when that plan is prepared, they find that there's a lot of restrictions on the development and it's very hard to change it. So council is again compromising their outcomes. The other issue that we looked at is the communication, and that's both internally and externally. Externally is basically is how the outside world uses the council's policies or the policy framework to deliver those waste management outcomes on the ground. And then you've got the internal communications as well, is how councils talk between the waste management sections and their planning sections. We're finding a disconnect between the planners who have a myriad of other things to consider, and you've got the waste management sections that are trying to achieve good outcomes using that planning framework. And that's it.